I know the last time I polled my audience about D&D, most of you said that you don't care about the hobby or even know what it is. And before you click off the video, I don't really plan to talk about the game all that much. However, today I wanted to talk more about one of the lessons I learned when playing Dungeons & Dragons and how I applied it to writing. So sit back, it's gonna be a shorter one because today we're talking about why motivations are more important than backstories. Now, you might be saying, backstories are important parts of writing, and for me, I think that's missing the point already. Yes, backstories can be important and sometimes necessary for understanding who a character is when you're writing your story. I also recognize that there is a difference between an interactive tabletop RPGs with other players at the table and something like a novel or a TV show. A backstory is the story before the character's real story. However, where I feel a lot of writers get it wrong is that the backstory is often not used to establish the why of a character's motivations or even the motivations at all, but instead to justify the character's existence in the story. However, before I get into that, let's talk about some decent backstories that we all know and love. Perhaps the tragic deaths of a mother and father who then caused our character to train in the mountains and dedicate all of their inherited wealth towards crime fighting. Or perhaps they're an alien who crash landed on planet Earth and who possessed superpowers beyond normal human limitations. No, editor, I'm not talking about Superman. Put Goku on the screen. That's better.
Hey, it's me!
Superman.
Anyways, regardless of what character it is, they often have an origin story or some sort of backstory which provides context to their future or present actions during the main story. However, the thing I've noticed with most beginner and amateur writers is that the backstory is often used more as an opportunity to justify the existence of a character rather than to provide the context to their actions and motivations. Here's what I mean. Let's say your character is a vampire and a werewolf or something. What would that backstory look like? Well, a lot of you would probably immediately come up with something about the person getting bitten by a vampire and then later on a werewolf, or perhaps this character has some sort of strange interspecies family, or basically any sort of story which explains how it's possible for someone to become a werewolf and a vampire at the same time. Now, here's the issue with that. How does this backstory provide any meaningful context to the actual story or establish motivations for this character? You might think, oh, well, it explains how they exist. And there it is. That's exactly what I'm talking about. Here's the issue with that. The simple answer is that it doesn't establish motivations or context for the story. All it does is explain how and why a character exists with these traits, but we've never truly ever explained who they are or what they think about it. In this scenario, do we really even need to go into the details of how this is possible? Could we also not simply write the world in such a way that they are either not a special case, or that there are a lot of vampires and werewolves everywhere, so we can assume it's possible to have a hybrid just by looking at their character? There's not really a backstory or any other explanation needed. They exist, and through existing, they establish that it is possible. We can all assume that there must have been a parent situation or a person who collected both curses somehow. Their backstory should be more about what they think of their existence rather than justifying the reasons that they exist. For example, if their backstory is that they were once a normal person, then how do they react to becoming a monster twice over? Do they like the fact that they have the powers of both a werewolf and a vampire? Or do they lament that they've become a monster among monsters, one who cannot be accepted by humans, nor vampires, nor werewolves, and is therefore an enemy to all? And in the case of a hereditary backstory, then what does our character think of their parents? What does the world think about their parents? What does the world think about them? as a character? What happens in their backstory for them to be motivated to progress the actual story? And while yes, we can come up with a tragic backstory for a character like this very easily, we can also exercise other types of motivation. We don't need this werewolf-vampire hybrid to be a taboo and forbidden love, nor do we need this character to be motivated by wanting to unify the two species in some grandiose way. This character could be motivated by something as innocuous and simple as food, but so long as it is something which they care deeply for and will take action to acquire, then it is a suitable motivation. In fact, their motivation doesn't really have to have anything to do with their heritage or the way that they're born. Their motivation doesn't need to stem from an early childhood trauma or a feeling of imposter syndrome. This vampire werewolf character could be motivated to study the natural world and biology, or want nothing more than to run a convenience store in some strange Halloween-type modern world. Motivations should also tie your character to the world and the other characters in the story. Who are they doing something for, and why? What effect do they seek to have on the world as a whole? Desires are important, and you should make sure that your character is driven more by their desires than they are by the nature of their origin. Perhaps their origin can align with their desires, such as the aforementioned werepire being motivated to hunt monsters to make sure no one lives a tortured existence like their own, but regardless, that motivation should be established in the backstory, or else just don't write the backstory. And while you can establish this motivation with a backstory, the backstory is not always necessary to see. A backstory is something which can sometimes enhance the story by giving justification for a character's actions and personality, but a backstory cannot work on its own. Once again, if the backstory is not centered around establishing and displaying motivation, then it's not a good backstory, and it's often not necessary to go into. If you find the need to justify a reason why a character has their motivations, then take a step back and question if a backstory is actually something which can serve that purpose. After all, the only justification you need for any sort of motivation is because they want to. Motivations don't need to be justified. They simply need to push a character to take action in the story. And when I say all of this, that doesn't mean backstories are useless or that you should not use them. What I am trying to say is that you should remind yourself what your goals are as a writer, as well as to determine what purpose you want your backstory to serve in the actual story. If you think you need to justify the existence and actions of your character, then start thinking about how you can instead display the context for how a character becomes motivated. Help the audience understand what motivates your character, or use the backstory to reveal those motivations to the audience. Regardless of what type of backstory it is, you should center it on the motivation of that character more than anything else. Spider-Man got his powers from a radioactive spider, sure, but his backstory and his origin is meant to establish his motivations for being a hero. With great power comes great responsibility. Batman's backstory is that he tragically saw his parents die in front of him, and then he dedicated his entire life towards fighting crime so that not another child has to go through the trauma that he did. These are backstories which not only explain why a character exists in the way they are, but establishes their core driving motivations for the things that they do in the story. But regardless of whether it's a motivation, a backstory, or both, you're never going to write anything if you're too busy justifying why you're not motivated to write anything. So take that story from the back of your mind, find your motivation, and start writing.